He pushed the door open slowly, every muscle tensed, his mind already running through scenarios. What he'd do if it was an intruder? What he'd do if it was worse than that? What he'd do if the woman he'd trusted with his life, with his home, with his wife, had turned out to be... What he saw wasn't what he expected. Not even close. Welcome to Mafia Tales and Secret. Let us know where you are watching from in the comment section. The rain hammered against the windows of the penthouse as Jin Sung pulled into the private garage 3 hours earlier than expected. The Tokyo deal had collapsed faster than anticipated, and something in his gut told him to come home. In 15 years of running the Cheongryong syndicate, he'd learned to trust that instinct. It had kept him alive when others had fallen. He sat in the car for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and let himself feel the exhaustion that he normally kept buried. Tokyo had been brutal. Not the negotiations themselves, but the realization that had hit him somewhere over the Pacific Ocean on the flight back. He was tired, bone-deep tired, not physically but spiritually. Every deal felt the same, every power play, every carefully calculated move. He'd built an empire, but somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten why. Minho would have understood. Minho always understood the things Jin Sung couldn't articulate. His brother had been the poet, the philosopher, the one who asked the uncomfortable questions about what they were really doing with their lives. Jin Sung had been the soldier, the strategist, the one who made the hard decisions so Minho wouldn't have to. And then Minho died. Or so Jin Sung had believed for 5 years. 5 years of carrying that weight. 5 years of every decision being filtered through the lens of honoring his brother's memory. Jin Sung finally climbed out of the car and moved through the underground garage. His footsteps echoed in the concrete space, and he found himself thinking about the last conversation he'd had with Minho. Really had with him before everything went wrong. They'd been in their father's study, and Minho had said something that Jin Sung had dismissed at the time, but that had haunted him ever since. Hyung, Minho had said, using the formal term for older brother that carried so much weight in their culture. Do you ever wonder if father loves us, or if he just loves what we can do for him? Jin Sung had laughed it off, told Minho he was being too philosophical again. Told him that in their world love and utility weren't separate things. But the question had lodged itself somewhere deep in his mind, and over the years, it had grown roots. He moved silently through the marble hallway now, his footsteps absorbed by Persian rugs worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. The house was too quiet. Usually music drifted from somewhere, or he'd hear Maria humming while she worked. Maria had been with them for 8 years, practically family. She'd seen everything, knew everything, and never asked questions. That's why they trusted her. But maybe, Jin Sung thought with a sudden chill, that was exactly why they shouldn't have. As he approached the master bedroom, he heard voices. Low, urgent. His hand instinctively moved toward the gun at his back. 15 years in this life had made certain reactions automatic. Trust no one completely. Always have an exit strategy. Always be ready for betrayal. But this was his home, his sanctuary, the one place where he'd allowed himself to believe he was safe. He pushed the door open slowly, every muscle tensed, his mind already running through scenarios. What he'd do if it was an intruder? What he'd do if it was worse than that? What he'd do if the woman he'd trusted with his life, with his home, with his wife, had turned out to be... What he saw wasn't what he expected, not even close. His wife Suyeon sat on the floor, surrounded by stacks of documents, her laptop open, tears streaming down her face. Not delicate tears. Not the kind of crying she did at sad movies or when she was overwhelmed with emotion at one of her charity galas. This was raw, ugly crying, the kind that came from somewhere deep and painful. Maria knelt beside her, A finger pressed to her lips as she noticed Jin Sung in the doorway. "Be quiet," Maria whispered, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made him freeze. In that moment, Jin Sung saw something in Maria's expression that rewrote 8 years of understanding. This wasn't the deferential housekeeper who brought him coffee exactly how he liked it. This wasn't the woman who smiled politely and disappeared into the background. This was someone else entirely. Someone trained, someone dangerous, someone who'd been wearing a mask the entire time he'd known her. On the laptop screen, a video played, and Jin Sung's blood turned to ice as he recognized the face on the screen. His own brother, Minho, but not Minho as Jin Sung remembered him. Not the vibrant, laughing young man who'd played piano and argued about philosophy and made everyone around him feel like the world was full of possibilities. This was someone broken, thin, with eyes that had seen too much and lost too much hope to hold on to anything real. Jin Sung's knees nearly buckled. He gripped the door frame and, somewhere in the back of his mind, he registered that his hand was shaking. He never shook. He'd faced down rival gang leaders, corrupt politicians, men who would kill him without a second thought. He'd stared into the barrel of a gun more times than he could count, and never once trembled. But this made him shake. Maria quickly paused the video and rushed to close the bedroom door behind him, engaging the lock with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. "You weren't supposed to be home," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos of the moment. Not apologetic, not frightened, just stating a fact. "What is this?" His voice came out as barely a whisper, and he hated how weak it sounded. "What are you showing her?" Suyan looked up at him, and the devastation in her eyes cut deeper than any blade. He'd seen his wife sad before, frustrated, angry even. But he'd never seen her look at him like this, like she was watching him break apart in real time and couldn't do anything to stop it. "Jin Sung," she said, her voice fracturing around his name. "Everything we thought we knew, it's all a lie." The words didn't make sense. Or rather, they made too much sense. They connected to that question Minho had asked years ago. They connected to the feeling Jin Sung had been carrying that something was wrong, something was off, something about his brother's death had never quite added up, but he'd been too consumed with grief and rage to examine it closely. Maria moved to the window, checking the street below with practiced efficiency. The movement was purely tactical, military, maybe, or law enforcement. Definitely not a housekeeper checking if it might rain. "We don't have much time," Maria said, still watching the street. "They'll know you came home early. They always know." Who will know?" Jin Sung demanded, but even as he asked, pieces were already clicking into place in his mind. The too convenient business trips. The deals that always seemed to fall apart at the last minute, sending him across the world on short notice. The feeling of being watched, even within his own organization, even in his own home. The way his father always seemed to know exactly where Jin Sung was, what he was doing, who he was meeting with. He'd attributed it to his father's legendary network of informants, to the old man's decades of experience in their world. But what if it was simpler than that? What if his father had never actually retired? What if the entire narrative of Jin Sung taking over, becoming his own man, building his own empire? What if all of it had been theater? Su-yeon stood, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, and Jin Sung saw something he'd never seen in his wife before. Not just sadness, not just grief or shock. Rage. Pure crystallized rage, the kind that had been building for a long time, compressed under pressure until it became something harder than diamond. "Your father," she said, and the way she pronounced those two words made them sound like a curse. "Your father faked Minho's death, and I can prove it." The world tilted. Jin Sung had built his empire on the foundation of his brother's murder. Every territory he'd claimed, every rival he'd eliminated, every decision he'd made for 5 years, all of it had been in Minho's name, in his memory, for revenge. He'd become harder after Minho died, more ruthless. His father had told him that was good, that grief could be channeled into strength, that the soft part of him had died with his brother, and what remained was the leader the Cheongryong syndicate needed. Jin Sung had believed him, had believed that the pain he carried was the price of honoring Minho's memory, had believed that every brutal decision, every calculated cruelty, every line he crossed was justified because it was for Minho, and it had all been a lie. "That's impossible," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Nothing was impossible, not in their world. He'd done impossible things himself, made people disappear, created new identities, staged deaths convincing enough that even forensic investigators believed them. If Jin Sung could do those things, his father, who'd been in this game for twice as long, who'd built the foundation Jin Sung operated on, could certainly do them too. His father, the legendary Kang Dae-jung, who'd supposedly retired to Jeju Island 5 years ago, leaving Jin Sung to run the family business. His father, who'd always favored Minho, who'd seen more potential in the younger son's charisma and intelligence than in Jin Sung's brutal efficiency. His father, who'd taught them both that, in their world, loyalty was the only currency that mattered. What kind of loyalty was this? Maria pulled the curtains closed, shutting out the city lights. The room felt smaller suddenly, more claustrophobic. 6 months ago, she said, her voice taking on a different quality now. Briefing mode, Jin Sung recognized, the tone of someone delivering intelligence to a commanding officer. Su Yon hired me to find the truth. Not as your housekeeper, as what I actually am. Jin Sung stared at the woman who'd served them dinner, cleaned their home, become part of their daily lives, who'd been there for birthdays and holidays and quiet Sunday mornings, who'd seen him at his worst, coming home covered in blood, and had simply drawn him a bath and burned his clothes without comment. "What are you?" "Interpol," Maria said simply, and the word hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. "Deep cover, but not for the reasons you think." The gun was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to draw it. Muscle memory, survival instinct, the automatic response to the word Interpol in a room where he was vulnerable. Su-yun stepped between them immediately, and that shocked Jin Sung almost as much as everything else. His wife, who'd never touched a weapon in her life, who'd built her entire identity around charity work and social causes, putting herself between him and a threat without hesitation. "No, Jin Sung, listen to me." Her voice was sharp, commanding, a voice he'd never heard her use before. "I hired her before she was Interpol. She was private intelligence. The best. I needed someone who could dig into your father's operations without being detected." Jin Sung's hand didn't lower, but he didn't fire either. He was suspended in this moment of impossible decisions, trying to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his life. "Why?" The word came out harsh. "Why would you investigate my father?" Su-yon's face crumpled slightly, and he saw guilt there. Deep, painful guilt. "Because I heard you crying," she said softly. 3 years ago. You thought I was asleep, but I heard you in your study, crying about Minho. And you said something that night. You said, 'It doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense.'" Jin Sung remembered that night. One of the few times he'd allowed himself to break down. One of the few times he'd let the grief overwhelm the anger. "You'd been drinking," Su-yon continued, "and you started going through the details of Minho's death out loud, questioning things, the timeline, the witnesses, the body. And then you passed out, and the next morning you never mentioned it again. You just Went back to being the version of yourself that runs this empire. But I couldn't forget what you said, she went on, her voice gaining strength. I couldn't forget that for one night when your guard was down, even you didn't believe the story. So I started asking questions, carefully, quietly, and the more I dug, the more things didn't add up. Maria finally spoke again. What she found made her come to me. I was freelance then, specializing in finding people who didn't want to be found. I've done extractions from North Korea, from Chinese black sites, from places that don't officially exist. Finding one person in Cambodia? That should have been easy. Cambodia? Jin Sung's voice was hollow. What she found, Su Yan said, and her voice cracked again. What she found made her go to Interpol. Because it's bigger than us. Bigger than the Cheongryong Syndicate. Bigger than anything we imagined. Maria's hands remained at her sides, calm despite the weapon still pointed in her general direction. Your father isn't retired, Jin Sung. He's been building something. A network that spans 12 countries. Human trafficking on a scale that makes most cartels look like amateurs. Political corruption at the highest levels. We're talking senators, judges, police commissioners. He needed you running Seoul to provide cover. To keep law enforcement focused on the visible operations while he built something much larger underneath. Jin Sung's mind was racing. 12 countries. That would require resources, connections, infrastructure that even he didn't have access to. But his father had been doing this for 40 years, had connections that went back to the military dictatorship days, had helped politicians rise to power and held their secrets like insurance policies. And he needed Min-ho. Maria trailed off, glancing at Su Yan. His wife finished the sentence, and Jin Sung heard steel in her voice underneath the pain. He needed Min-ho broken, controlled, dependent. The word dependent hit Jin Sung like a physical blow. He lowered the guns slowly, not because he'd made a conscious decision to trust them, but because his hand had gone numb. His whole body had gone numb. Show me everything, he said. What followed was the longest 30 minutes of Jin Sung's life. They laid it out methodically, and he recognized Su Yan's organizing principle behind the presentation. She'd structured it like one of her charity presentations, building the case piece by piece so the conclusion became inevitable. Maria had documentation that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. Financial records showing money moving through shell corporations across Southeast Asia. Video surveillance from ports in Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, showing shipping containers being loaded and unloaded with very specific timing and security protocols. Testimonies from witnesses who'd been too terrified to come forward. Until Maria found them, offered them protection, convinced them their silence was enabling ongoing atrocities. There were photos. Jin Sung made himself look at each one, even though every image was a knife twisting in his gut. Women, children, packed into spaces barely fit for animals. And in the corner of one photo, barely visible, a figure that Jin Sung recognized. His father, supervising, checking a manifest, looking at human beings the same way someone might inventory office supplies. These operations have been running for 8 years, Maria explained, her voice clinical, professional. Since right around the time Min-ho supposedly died. The timing isn't a coincidence. Su Yan pulled up a new folder on the laptop. And at the center of it all, Min-ho. The next video was harder to watch than anything Jin Sung had ever seen. And he'd seen terrible things, had done terrible things. But nothing compared to watching his brother, alive but not living. Min-ho sat in what looked like a hotel room, expensive, luxury furnishings. But the opulence made it worse somehow, made the contrast sharper with the obvious devastation in his brother's eyes. A man Jin Sung didn't recognize entered the frame. European, maybe, expensive suit, the body language of someone used to power. He sat down across from Min-ho, and Jin-sung watched his brother flinch slightly. Not obviously, but Jin-sung knew Min-ho's mannerisms, knew what every small movement meant. His brother was terrified. Soo-yeon knelt beside him where he'd collapsed onto the floor, and he saw tears streaming down her face again. Because I wasn't sure at first. I had suspicions, had pieces of evidence, but nothing concrete. And because... She paused, clearly struggling with the words. Because I was terrified of what you'd do. What I'd do? He looked up at her, not understanding. Jin-sung, you've killed people for less than lying to you. Your own father orchestrated a deception that rewrote your entire life. I needed proof before I destroyed you with the truth. And I needed... Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I needed a plan to get Min-ho out alive, because I knew that the moment you learned the truth, you'd go after him. You'd burn everything to the ground to save your brother. And your father would kill Min-ho rather than let you take him. The calculation in her words, the cold, strategic thinking. This was a side of Soo-yeon he'd never seen, and it should have frightened him. Instead, he felt something else. Gratitude. Because she'd thought this through. She'd understood him better than he understood himself. She'd known he'd be reckless, destructive, likely to get himself and Min-ho killed in a blind rage. She'd loved him enough to protect him from his own worst instincts. Do you have one? He asked quietly. A plan? Maria opened another laptop, and Jin-sung noticed for the first time that the room was filled with equipment. Professional surveillance gear, communications devices, military-grade encryption systems. How long had they been planning this? How many nights had they worked while he slept, building this operation right under his nose? Your father is hosting a summit in 3 days, Maria said, pulling up a satellite image of a compound in Macau. Every major player in his network will be there, politicians from 4 countries, cartel representatives from South America, triad leaders from Hong Kong. It's a yearly meeting where they coordinate operations, divide territories, settle disputes.
She zoomed in on one building within the compound. And he's bringing Min-ho. As entertainment, essentially. To show off his control. To demonstrate to his partners that he has assets that make him indispensable. The cold calculation of it made Jin-sung want to vomit. His father was parading Min-ho like a trophy. Proof that Kang Dae-young could break anyone, control anyone, turn even his own son into a useful tool. It's disgusting, Maria continued, and Jin-sung heard real anger in her voice for the first time. But it's also our only opportunity. Security will be tight, but it's primarily focused on external threats. They're not expecting an internal attack. And everyone who matters will be in one place. Our. Jin-sung looked at her sharply. Maria met his eyes steadily. I'm done being deep cover. What your father is running, the scale of human suffering, I've been documenting it for 8 months, building a case. But Interpol moves slowly. Bureaucracy. Politics. People protecting their assets. By the time they're ready to move officially, your father will have caught wind of the investigation. He'll disappear, destroy evidence, and Min-ho. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They all knew what would happen to Min-ho if Kang Dae-young felt cornered. Jin-sung stood slowly, his mind already shifting into a different mode. Not the grief-stricken brother. Not the shocked son discovering his father's betrayal. Something colder. More focused. The part of him that had been forged in this world, that understood strategy and violence and calculated risk. But this time, that calculation wasn't for power or revenge or expanding his empire. It was for something he'd thought lost forever. Family. Real family. Not the twisted version his father had sold him. Maria, he said, and his voice had changed too. This was the voice he used when planning operations. When lives hung in the balance and there was no room for error. How many people do you have that you trust absolutely? She considered the question carefully. 4. All former military. Special Forces. 2 from the French Foreign Legion, 1 ex-SAS, 1 from the South Korean Special Warfare Command. All of them have personal reasons to want your father's operation burned to the ground. Personal reasons. 1 lost his sister to trafficking. 1 had his career destroyed when he tried to investigate corruption that led back to your father's network. The other 2. She paused. They're good people who've seen too much evil and want to do something about it. Jin Sung did the math in his head. That's not enough. We'll need at least 20 for what I'm planning. More if the security is as tight as you're describing. Su Yun stood as well, and Jin Sung saw determination replacing the grief in her expression. I can get you 15 more. Legitimate security. People who owe me favors from my foundation work. Jin Sung looked at his wife, really looked at her, and felt something shift in his understanding of their entire relationship. He'd always known she was intelligent, compassionate, strong in the ways that mattered. But he'd underestimated her. Fundamentally and completely underestimated her. She'd been running her own operation for 6 months, right under his nose, in his own home. She'd hired private intelligence, made connections with Interpol, built a network of contacts and resources. All while maintaining the facade of being the charitable wife who hosted fundraisers and smiled for cameras. Your foundation, he said slowly. The one helping trafficking victims. Su Yun nodded, and he saw shame flicker across her face. Some of them were from your father's operations. I didn't know it at first. I was just trying to help, trying to do something good with the blood money that funded my life. But once Maria and I started putting pieces together. She walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. Jin Sung, the women I've been helping escape. Some of them knew Minho. They'd seen him. They'd been held in the same facilities. That's how we confirmed he was alive. One woman, a girl really, barely 19, she described him perfectly. Down to the scar on his wrist from when he fell off his bike as a child. Jin Sung remembered that scar. Remembered Minho crying, more from embarrassment than pain, while their mother bandaged the cut. Remembered making up a story about how it was actually a battle wound from fighting off dragons, and how Minho had laughed and played along. She said. Su Yun's voice wavered. She said Minho tried to help her once. Tried to convince one of the guards to let her go. And they beat him for it. Beat him so badly she thought they'd killed him. But they didn't kill him. They just made sure he never tried to help anyone again. The rage that had been building in Jin Sung's chest crystallized into something cold and purposeful. His father had taught him many things over the years. How to read people. How to identify weaknesses and exploit them. How to plan an operation so thoroughly that failure wasn't an option. How to be ruthless when necessary. It was time to use those lessons against the teacher. All right, he said, and both women turned to look at him. Here's what we're going to do. He moved to the table where Maria had spread out the intelligence reports and began organizing them differently, seeing patterns and possibilities that came from 15 years of running operations in this world. We're going to split this into 3 primary objectives. First, extract Minho alive. That's non-negotiable. Everything else is secondary to getting him out safely. Maria nodded, already making notes. Second, we're going to document everything happening at that summit. Every attendee. Every conversation. Every piece of evidence that can be used to dismantle my father's entire network. This isn't just about revenge. This is about making sure that when we're done, there's nothing left for him to rebuild. Su Yun was recording his words on her phone, and he saw the fierce approval in her eyes. Third, and this is the hardest part, we need to do all of this without getting anyone killed who doesn't deserve it. Maria, you said there are guards at the compound? Yes. Private security. Some of them are just doing a job, don't necessarily know what they're protecting. Then we plan for incapacitation, not elimination. I've spent 5 years becoming the kind of person who kills without hesitation. I'm done being that person. Minho wouldn't want me to save him by becoming more of what our father tried to make me. The words felt strange coming out of his mouth. Foreign. But also right in a way that nothing had felt right in years. For the next hour, they planned. Jin Sung's tactical knowledge combined with Maria's intelligence expertise and Suyun's logistical skills created something that was almost beautiful in its precision. They identified weak points in the compound's security. They planned contingencies for every possible complication. They built in redundancies so that if one part of the operation failed, the others could still succeed. And slowly, Jin Sung felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Hope. Not the bitter, angry hope that maybe one day he'd find his brother's killers and make them pay. But real hope. The possibility that Minho was alive, that they could save him, that maybe, just maybe, they could all have a second chance at something better. There's one more thing, Maria said as they finalized the operational timeline. Interpol will want assurances. They're providing satellite support, extraction helicopters, intelligence assets. But they need to know this isn't just a gang war dressed up as a rescue operation. Jin Sung understood what she was really asking. What do they need from me? Testimony. Full cooperation. You'd need to provide documentation on the Chongryang Syndicate's operations. Testify against your father and everyone involved in his network. And she hesitated. Accept the consequences for your own actions. Prison time, Jin Sung said flatly. Almost certainly. How much depends on what you've actually done, what can be proven, what deals the prosecutors might offer. But yes. You'd be giving up your freedom. Jin Sung looked at Suyun, and she looked back at him with eyes that held no judgment. Just a question. Just the space for him to make his own choice. I'll do more than testify, he said finally. I'll give them everything. Every contact. Every operation. Every dirty secret in the Chongryang files. But Minho gets immunity. And protection. For life. And you? Maria asked quietly. Jin Sung thought about the last 5 years. The violence. The corruption. The lines he'd crossed thinking he was honoring his brother's memory. He'd done terrible things, and for what? To build an empire on a foundation of lies. To serve his father's ambitions without even knowing it. I'll take whatever consequences come, he said. But not until my brother is safe and my father is in custody. Maria nodded slowly. I'll make the calls. But Jin Sung, you need to understand, once we start this, there's no going back. Your old life is over. The Chongryang Syndicate is finished. And everyone who's ever been loyal to you or your father will consider you a traitor. Good, Jin Sung said, and meant it. That life was built on a lie anyway. Time to build something real. Over the next 72 hours, Jin Sung discovered who he might have been if his father hadn't shaped him into a weapon. He reached out to contacts his father didn't know about, people Jin Sung had cultivated independently, relationships built on genuine respect rather than fear or obligation. The response surprised him. When he explained what he was really fighting for, not power, not territory. But his brother's life, people wanted to help. Not all of them. Some disappeared the moment they heard he was moving against his father. But enough stayed. Enough believed in him, or believed in the cause, or simply hated Kang Dae-young enough to risk everything. The head of a rival syndicate, a man named Park who'd been Jin Sung's enemy for years, showed up at a clandestine meeting with an unexpected offer. My daughter, Park said without preamble. She was taken 3 years ago. Trafficking ring. I found her eventually, but His voice broke slightly. She was never the same. If your father's network had anything to do with that, I want in. Jin Sung showed him Maria's documentation, and watched the other man's face go white with rage as he recognized locations, names, operational patterns. I'll give you whatever you need, Park said. Weapons. Transport. Men. All of it. A corrupt police captain named Lee, who'd been on Jin Sung's payroll for years, turned out to have his own reasons for wanting Kong Dae-young brought down. Your father has been blackmailing me for 15 years, Lee admitted during a secret meeting in a parking garage. I made one mistake. One stupid mistake when I was young. And he's owned me ever since. If you're really taking him down, if you're really burning his operation to the ground, I'll help. I'll give you everything I know about the security at the Macau compound. Even some of Jin Sung's own lieutenants, when they learned the truth, pledged their loyalty to him rather than to the organization his father had built. We follow you, one of them said simply. Not the Chongryong name. Not your father. You. And if you're doing this to save your brother, then we're with you. The realization was both humbling and empowering. Jin Sung had always assumed people followed him out of fear or greed. He'd never considered that some of them might actually believe in him as a person. Su-yun proved to be a revelation. Her experience running a legitimate non-profit had taught her skills that translated perfectly to planning a complex operation. She understood logistics, how to move people and equipment without drawing attention. She understood resource management, how to stretch limited assets across multiple objectives. And she understood people, how to motivate them, coordinate them, keep everyone focused on the primary mission. She created detailed schedules. Mapped out communication protocols. Anticipated problems before they occurred and built solutions into the operational plan. Watching her work, Jin Sung understood that his wife had been preparing for something like this her entire adult life. Maybe not consciously, but all those years of coordinating charity events and managing volunteers and solving complex logistical puzzles had been training for this moment. You're incredible, he told her one night as they reviewed the operational timeline for the 100th time. She looked up from her laptop, and he saw exhaustion in her eyes but also satisfaction. I spent 8 years feeling useless, she said quietly. Playing the role of the mob wife who smiles and hosts parties and doesn't ask questions. But I was asking questions, Jin Sung. I was always asking questions. I just didn't have the resources to find answers until I found Maria. Why didn't you tell me about what you were feeling? Su-yun was quiet for a long moment. Because I was afraid you'd tell me to stop. That you'd say it was too dangerous or that I was overstepping. And I couldn't stop. Once I started looking into Minho's death, once I started seeing the inconsistencies, I couldn't unsee them. I couldn't just go back to hosting fundraisers and pretending everything was fine. Jin Sung pulled her close, and she leaned into him, and they sat there in silence for a while. Two people who'd thought they knew each other completely, discovering there were depths they'd never explored. After this is over, he said quietly, assuming we survive it, I want you to know that I see you now. Really see you. Not as my wife who needs to be protected. But as my partner. My equal. The person who saved me from myself. She kissed him softly. We're saving each other, she said. Thank you for watching. Drop your honest comments about the story. Click the subscribe button, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy listening. It's your support that makes this community grow. See you in our next Mafia tale and secret.